Okay, good afternoon. This is the regularly scheduled meeting of the Public Safety, Civil Rights, and Emergency Management Committee. My name is Wang Yang. I'm the chair of this committee. With me today are council members Palmisano, Gordon, Quincy, and Council President Johnson. We are a quorum of this committee, and we can conduct this committee's business. I believe Councilmember Reich will be joining us shortly, though I'm not quite sure. Today is September 27th. And today we have 6 items on our agenda. The first 5 items are consent items, and the 6th item is a discussion item. Item number 1 of consent is a 2018 contract amendment with Hennepin County to provide detox van services. Item number 2 is the contract amendment with Minnesota Crisis Intervention Team Officers Association. Item number 3 is a 2017 Emergency Management Performance Grant, providing federal funds to states to assist in preparing for all hazard incidents. Item number 4 is a 2017 Urban Areas Security Initiative Grant to address the unique risk-driven and capabilities-based planning and needs of high-threat, high-density urban areas. And item number 5 is a city employee residency ordinance, and this is referring to staff the subject matter of an ordinance with regards to personnel for first reading and referral to this committee, repealing Article X entitled City Employee Residency. Anyone want to pull anything off for discussion? Right, seeing none, all those in approval of all 5 items, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Okay, motion carries. All right, the 6th item is a discussion item, and it's probably what all the cameras here are for. It's the Minneapolis Police Department mobile and body-worn video recording equipment programs audit. And this is an issue that came up, several months ago, but, this is kind of in line with what this committee is supposed to be doing anyway, just with regards to reviewing what's been happening with body-worn cameras. And so with us today is our city auditor, and this is a stand-in for our city auditor, but Carol, please come on up and introduce yourself, and don't let me butcher your name. And you're standing in for Will Tetzel. Yep. So thank you for joining us, and after the presentation, we will have questions from council members with regards to the audit itself, but just how we move forward and how we improve. And with us today are Assistant Chief Jose and Deputy Chief Halverson. So thank you both for being here.
Chairman Yang, committee members, my name is Kirill Vasilyev, and I'm a manager in the Internal Audit Department. I'm here to present the audit of the police department's mobile and body-worn video recording programs. The objectives of the audit were to determine whether the cameras and the programs were being used and executed in accordance with state statutes and with department policies. We also looked at the adequacy of how things were designed, administered, and monitored. The scope of the audit was the Minnesota state statute legislative requirements. We reviewed IT general controls, and we of course reviewed general usage and the body-worn camera policy. We're covering the material in kind of 5 pieces. The first is Minnesota state statutes, then a few comments on equipment and software, policy training, the usage of this equipment, and oversight. So for Minnesota state statutes, the Minnesota statute was broken down into 56 specific components that were testable. Of those, 16 were noted as non-compliant, mostly included items that the state statute says a body-worn camera policy must include, that our policy did not. This doesn't mean we weren't doing these things. It just means that the policy didn't specifically address how we were doing. The non-compliant areas also included access authorization procedures and the classification of videos into public and not public. We also noted 17 of those 56 items were compliant but could be enhanced or made clear in the policy as to how we were complying. and a few were non-testable. For example, the provision that a biennial audit must be done, we couldn't test because we were performing the biennial audit. For equipment, we looked at how the equipment was designed and selected and the software. In general, the equipment is adequate for a typical 10-hour shift and does a good job protecting the integrity of the data that is on it. The software is CGIS compliant. It's a cloud environment, so maintaining data is done very effectively. The software, which is evidence.com, is also has very great audit logging software in terms of every single activity that is done with every single video and every single piece of equipment. We're able to go in and see and review. There were some observations, mainly focused around how MPD was implementing the software, and that relates to ensuring proper access, documenting the access procedures and approvals for access, and for ensuring data categorization. These are very closely linked to the state statute items from the last slide. For policy and training, we had a few observations on policy focused on policy noncompliance, mainly around cameras not being used in line with policy as best we could tell from the data, and also not labeling and categorizing videos in line with policy. The policy completeness and clarity, there were some observations around areas in policy that were maybe not crystal clear, that could be improved by better examples or more verbiage as to what the policy element means. And then the first bullet under policy completeness and clarity there is the policy really focused on how the police department used cameras and used the software, and it didn't quite align with the Minnesota state statute requirements, which really talked more about a body camera program, which encompasses more than just using the camera and the software. So we saw some opportunities to have the policy be more complete in terms of that. For training, we reviewed the training materials and they were pretty well aligned with the policy as it was written. There were a few minor elements that didn't get fully covered that we had comments on. And we have a fairly long list of the specific examples of policy noncompliance and completeness and clarity that was included in the full report. But it's a bit too much verbiage to put on slides here. Moving on to usage, the usage period that we reviewed did cover prior to and after the new policy change, which happened at the end of July. We looked at about 3.5 weeks of data after the policy change, and we grouped our observations into the elements of how body cameras are getting used. So we would have some startup, activation, use, deactivation, and then upload and categorization comments. We also have some general stats on how the cameras were getting used to present here. So for startup, at the beginning of a shift, when a camera is picked up by an officer, they're required to do a startup check to ensure the camera works before they go out in the field. We noted that this startup check was not always being done. We also noted in some instances when there was a startup check, it was done in the middle of a shift or towards the end of a shift, which defeats the purpose of ensuring that the equipment works before you're out in the field. From the policy change, we can see that there's a much better track record of doing startups under the new policy. Looking at activation, we noted that there were several events for which activation is expected under policy, both under the new policy and under the old policy. When we went to try and find those corresponding videos in the software, we were not always able to do so. And those were primarily use of force videos where activation is required before or immediately after an incident. And we also looked at dispatch records to try and figure out under which circumstances did an officer respond and arrive at the scene with an issued camera, and were we able to find footage of that incident in the evidence. And you can see here on the left side, the CAD dispatch-based videos, we were unable to find 35% under the old policy, and 29% a lower incidence under the new policy. We also noted that for activation, cameras were not always capturing the beginning of events, and those are the data sets in the middle, and we see that they generally are improved under the new policy. And finally, the cameras have a 30-second buffering feature where if your camera is on, it always records 30 seconds, and when you push the record button, it goes back in time for those 30 seconds, it adds it to the beginning of the video, so you have a little bit of leeway before something occurs that you're still capturing on video. That only works if the camera's on, and we noted a number of instances where that 30 seconds wasn't captured in full, meaning that officers were keeping their cameras fully powered off until they decided that it was time to activate them. That means we're not capturing the 30-second buffer, and because we're not always capturing the beginning of the incident, that buffer is a little bit more critical to be able to have. This was also an area that was not really covered in the policy as to when you need to have your camera physically switched on versus not. So once the camera has been activated, the purpose is to capture the incident and see what's going on. When we reviewed videos, we tried to see whether it was clearly the cameras were clearly capturing what was occurring. The lowest rate of capture was for use of force incidents, and that is likely because in use of force incidents, there's a lot more activity. There's also a very precise moment at which use of force generally occurs, so it's much easier to miss that specific moment in a camera footage that as you're walking around and doing any kind of activity. We also noted that in a number of use of force videos, the full chain of events that led up to the use of force wasn't captured. So maybe it captured a takedown, but the initial confrontation with an individual wasn't always getting captured, for example. And again, after policy change, we did see a slight decrease in number of instances where we weren't actually capturing what was going on in the cameras. For deactivation, the policy dictates when deactivation is appropriate. Generally, it's after the event has concluded. If the event concludes before, if the deactivation occurs before the event concludes, it's required that the reason for deactivation is narrated by the officer. So we noted a variety of numbers in terms of how often deactivation happened before the incident. It ranged from 32% of use of force videos under the old policy to 4% of dispatch-based selections under the new policy were deactivated prior to the full conclusion of an event. We also, of those events that were, of those instances where footage was turned off early, we looked and saw whether or not there was a narration, and we saw a pretty wide range. Most of the time, there was no narration as to why the deactivation was occurring. That generally dropped out under the new policy with a slight uptick in use of force, not narrating the reason for deactivation. We also noted with deactivation, we weren't able to look for this systemically, but we noted after the fact that when transporting individuals to jail, body cameras were frequently turned off prior to handing over custody of the individual to jail. And so we did extract that data from the different sets and presented it here because that was, per policy, the transport needs to be recorded. And if you're not turning off, if you're not leaving the camera on until after transferring custody, that appears to be out of line with current policy. So once the video has been captured, they need to be uploaded into the system by the officer at the end of their shift. Policy requires to do so at the end of the shift. We looked at the average time to upload a video. Shifts are usually about 10 hours long, so we'd expect about a 5-hour average time to upload the video after it's been taken. But we generally saw longer times to get that upload to happen, with 18 hours under the old policy and 10.5 hours under the new policy. We also noted a fair number of officers that had an average upload time of over 30 hours. So that is clearly doing so the day after or several days after a shift ends on average. And again, with the policy change, we're definitely seeing a decrease in time to upload, which means more officers are likely doing the upload at the end of their shifts in line with policy. So after the videos are uploaded, officers are required to categorize the videos and add in a case or dispatch number related to that occurrence, if applicable. We saw 11% of all videos were not categorized with anything under the old policy, which dropped to 5% under the new policy. So we definitely noted videos that were not categorized. We did also see some instances of a case number that should have been included with the video, but that wasn't. We did also look at, as we were looking at different categories of videos, whether or not the video had the correct categorization, and noted that not always the right categorization was used. We got these numbers a few different ways. With use of force, we looked at reported uses of force, found that video, and noted that in 14 and then 31% of cases under the new policy, the video wasn't flagged with use of force. It might have been flagged with arrest or citation or something else. For non-evidence, we looked at videos that were tagged with a case number, but were listed as non-evidence, as trying to target ones that maybe should have been flagged as evidentiary or arrests or citations. For dispatch-based, that's pretty straightforward. We'll look for dispatch records and look to see whether those types of videos were categorized properly, whether it was use of force or evidence or non-evidence. I wanted to note training. Training videos are kept for only 90 days, unlike the next best retention period, which is a year. We did see a fairly large number of training videos not being categorized properly, but most of those miscategorizations are somebody driving for 3 minutes and then turning off their camera, or look like 3 or 4 seconds of accidental activation. So we didn't see a systemic pattern of somebody trying to hide footage under training so it'd get deleted early. And then the last item on here is a video can be tagged with multiple categories, but that was never really addressed. And we saw different uses of that affecting our results. For example, a use of force video was flagged with only an arrest, which is accurate. However, it was also a use of force, and that seems to be the more important category that wasn't being used, possibly because of confusion. We also saw some results where video was flagged with both evidence and non-evidence tags, which didn't really make sense. So clarification on that aspect would be helpful. Some overall usage numbers. We definitely saw an increase in usage under the new policy versus the old policy. However, we did see a wide variation of use between individual officers when we looked at averages per individual. In particular, we saw a fairly large number of folks having less than 1 minute of video per hour of active in the field policing. That did decrease from 17% under the old policy to just 7% under the new policy. And we have a few charts in here to illustrate that. So this is the number of hours worked. This is basically says what percentage of my time in the field is getting recorded on body cameras. And we're seeing it was lingering around 5% to dipping below, and then spiking up towards the end when the new policy came in place to between 10 and sometimes 20% on average across the police department. And then this represents a per user perspective on what percentage of time is getting recorded. So we're seeing that 5% mark is about 3 minutes of footage per hour worked. So we saw under the old policy, a majority of officers were having less than 3 minutes of footage. And under the new policy, we definitely see a huge increase, including a few officers that are recording 40% or more of their time in the field. But we're still seeing a tail end of individuals that have less than 3 minutes or 1 minute of their field time recorded.
Can I just interrupt you just for a second? With regards to this slide, when we talk about percentage of work time recorded by officers, we're talking about you isolating it so that it's just purely officers, not sergeants and lieutenants in this case, right?
Chairman Yang, we looked at it from both perspectives, and This graph is specific to officers. Yes, we excluded lieutenants and sergeants, which were included in some data, but not in others. They tended to have lower usage numbers because they're working very specific things that maybe don't need to be always recorded. And then our last chevron up here relates to oversight. When looking at the program, we did have oversight and monitoring and how it was being handled, part of our audit scope and objectives. And the goals of the program are to enhance accountability and public trust, and to provide the police department with procedures on how to use and manage the equipment and resulting data. We didn't really see anything in the policy or the program as to who's in charge of making sure everything is running smoothly, that the video is being captured and the cameras are being used in line with policy. We do want to acknowledge that the BTU did their job they did the pilot program, they rolled out all the equipment and the technology and trained everyone and developed the training. But in the end, they're not responsible for ensuring that an officer turns their camera on. They can train someone how to push the button, but they can't enforce that. And after that implementation phase, we didn't really see anybody getting into the oversight or the management. We did see that June of this year, about a year after the first cameras were being issued, there was training developed and pushed out to supervisors on how to conduct reviews of their reports in evidence.com to make sure that they're taking videos. But it wasn't a systematic rollout, and it wasn't in place when we were doing our review, so we couldn't really look at any records related to that kind of assessment. And that's the report. I do have a few more graphs on specific usage by age group and by precinct, but that's more of a interesting information, but not really findings or issues.
Councilmember Gordon, I'm going to call on Councilmember Palmisano first. And, I'm doing that just because we get the privilege of having the audit chair be a member of our committee as well. And so this came through your committee first. And, any observations, any questions you might have, if you can open us off, that would be great.
Sure, Mr. Chair. Well, I just have a whole smattering of smaller questions, and some of them I think are more appropriate for Mr. Vasiliev, and then others are maybe more appropriate for Assistant Chief Jose or Deputy Chief Halverson.
Why don't you save your questions for the Assistant Chief and the Deputy Chief until maybe a little bit later, but let's comments with regards to the audit and questions with regards to the audit.
Yep. Well, first, I just wanted to, I want to thank the audit team that did this work. This was a body of work that was significant, that was asked for in a very short turnaround phase. So just to kind of tee this off and say this was a less than 2-month turnaround on an incredible amount of data. And it also was the initiative and impetus to be able to test out the same kinds of information in 2 different ways, right before a major policy change and after a major policy change. So they were working within a very dynamic environment. So I want to appreciate that and thank you for that, and know that we've been sitting with these findings now for a little bit more than a week out in the public sphere. A couple specific questions that I had in terms of your data and your slides is, one was the upload of videos. I'm curious why you tested that. Like what was important about that from an audit perspective? Was it a concern about loss of data? Like if all of a sudden a body camera were to disappear? I don't think we actually have a lot of loss of the body cameras in our program. So I'm just curious what made us pick up on that and look at how fast officers upload videos. Why does it matter?
Chairman Yang, Council Member Palmisano, the policy states that officers will upload their footage at the end of a shift. We had the time when the video was taken and when it was uploaded. It was a fairly straightforward test to do to see whether that was being compliant with the policy. It's important because if events are unfolding quickly and cameras are not being docked and uploaded in a timely fashion, we might not have footage available. Aside from that, there was no real concern about data integrity or the ability of anybody to hack the camera and try to get the footage out. That's not likely. The most damage somebody could do would be lose a camera or physically destroy it, at which point that would be pretty apparent that that's occurred. So it's not really a data integrity issue. It's a policy compliance and having data available timely if necessary issue.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I will reserve my other questions for police on coding and how we can maybe get officers to code their recordings correctly. But to that end, I have a question, and it might be more appropriate for the city attorney. All use of force videos are public data by law in Minnesota, so miscategorization is also a problem here. Is that your understanding, that all use of force videos are open dataable and public data?
The state law is that all data, including camera data, would be public unless there's parts of it that are classified otherwise for various reasons. I haven't reviewed the specific designation for camera data recently, but I can take a look at that if you would like me to.
I'm just curious about that.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I'll turn it over to other questions.
Okay. Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you very much. I guess I have not so much questions about the data and the information that was revealed. It's very interesting and valuable to think about, but just about the process. Did we follow the standard process of doing the audit with this, or was our fast tracking, did we miss some steps or not get everything done as well as we should?
Chairman Yang, Councilmember Gordon, our fast tracking resulted in us providing the report without having a full implementation plan discussion and a formal response from the auditee, in this case, the police department. By the time we had the report available to us in a substantively completed form, when we were discussing it with the police department, it didn't seem reasonable to give them, a very short turnaround time from an implementation plan. We were directed by the audit committee to work with MPD on implementation as part of our presentation. So while we don't have that component of it in place, which we typically do prior to issuing a report, we're still going to do that. We just didn't have time to do it based on the turnaround times.
Did you have the usual entrance conference before the field work started?
Chairman Yang, Councilmember Gordon, we had an entrance conference with BTU. I'd have to double check my records as to who else was involved. I believe Commander Granger was involved, but I don't have the full list of attendees in my memory, unfortunately. And we did issue an engagement letter as per our usual process.
We did have an engagement letter 3 weeks prior to the field work? And in this case, was the client seen as the police department? Usually it seems like when there's an audit done here, we identify somebody, and I think I'm using the right term, maybe client's the wrong term, but the partner that we're doing it with, I got to participate in one with neighborhood community relations a little bit because there was a big audit on their work, and I know I was part of an entrance process and also participated in an I think it was called a exit conference also. So was there an exit conference that was held before the final draft was written?
Chairman Yang, Commissioner Gordon, there was an exit conference held. I believe it ended up getting scheduled for the day before the audit committee. Unfortunately, I was not present for that, and I don't have the details of how our director arranged for it or when, and I'm not sure if maybe Councilmember Palmisano has more information.
Councilmember Palmisano.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I can provide some more information about that. The audit committee is a regularly scheduled meeting, but it doesn't happen very frequently. So the audit committee date was kind of driving the results of this audit. We had tried to set up with the police department their full exit interview the week prior to the audit committee meeting. It ended up getting pushed to the day before the audit committee meeting, and at the last minute, Deputy Chief Halverson made it, but Chief Arredondo chose not to make that meeting that day. So Deputy Chief Halverson had the results of the audit before the audit committee meeting, as did the city attorney, the members of the audit committee, others around the city. The actual engagement letter, it was, if you recall, it was actually initiated first from Public Safety Committee, this audit, instead of, as is typical, where it gets initiated at audit committee. So that engagement letter had a number of people on it within the police department. It was a pretty standard engagement letter. It also went to the audit committee members because we were initiating this process first through Public Safety Committee.
I suppose we could have gotten the report before and it could have gone to the next audit committee meeting. It looks like you're supposed to actually do the exit conference before the draft is written, when you just have the final work paper reviews ready, and then you have your exit conference, and then you draft the audit report, and then the report goes, is delivered within 1 week of that exit conference. But it sounds like this report was written before the exit conference.
Chairman Yang, Councilmember Gordon, yes, but I don't know how much of the information in here was surprising and new. I think it shouldn't be that surprising that not all officers are using their cameras. Perhaps the specific numbers are. I mean,
it probably wasn't. I guess the stark thing that I noticed immediately when I picked up this and was looking at this, and I probably should have done it before the council meeting. I was looking at summaries and about it and didn't get to it until, but I decided I'm going to review it before this committee, is that all the other audits that I've ever seen, it does finding, field work, response, finding, field work, response. And here we have field work and then a finding in a box, and nowhere is there a response from MPD in here. And I'm trying to figure out, didn't they have time? Why aren't they given a response? Why are we forwarding an incomplete audit to the state? So it just concerns me about it, but you can consider that opinion. You don't have to respond to that if you don't want to. It might be good to hear from the department when they come back. But I am also curious because I know that back in July, I believe we directed the audit department, or we asked the audit department, and we directed civil rights to participate and be involved in this process. I think we had an interest in the police conduct oversight function to be involved in that. And how did we make sure that civil rights was involved? And if Mr. Farr wants to answer about her role, that would be fine too.
Chairman Yang, Councilmember Gordon, I think nobody had enough time to complete the full steps of the process. We definitely did our work and ensured that we were reporting based on our factual observations. We recognized that by the time we were able to have a report in time for the audit committee and to be able to come back to this committee in line with the timeline established when we were directed to do this report, we didn't have time to get the full response from the police department. This is also slightly atypical of our audits because normally our audits, we report, here's the finding. In here, we did report, here's all of our observations and not just the findings. So we had information around state statutes that we were compliant with. We had some usage statistics that we didn't have a finding on. They were just information that we presented. So the format of the report was a little different because we were trying to capture things in a different way. And again, the audit committee did direct us to work with the police department on their response, and we fully intend to do that as much as they are willing to work with us. As to the question on participation from OPCR, we did our planning work together, and they were an invaluable help in a number of policy issues and in reviewing a number of videos where the call of is this evidence or non-evidence is something that I don't have experience doing for certain nuances. They were very helpful with that, and they were also confirming some of our observations as we were going along.
Chair Yang, Councilmember Gordon, I did want to clarify because that is Office of Police Conduct Review and Police Conduct Oversight Commission, which we work directly with. So 2 of my staff members who do analysis work were involved in the audit. It was an internal audit-led project, and so Director Will Tetzel gave direction to our analysts to do specific work related to some of the things that were mentioned, and then that they did research work directed on that alone and then didn't participate in writing the report at the end, but kind of helped with questions and gathering information. But then the Director Will Tetzel came and presented to the Police Conduct Oversight Commission at their last public meeting, and they asked quite a bit of questions about the report itself and ideas related to their own observations from 2015, which I think we're all aware of. But they received the report on the same day, actually, that the audit committee received the report. In the evening was their public meeting.
And did you participate in the exit conference then too?
I did not, and my staff did not. So essentially, when the writing process started is kind of when our involvement ended. I think, as I mentioned when we first presented this to council, because my office participates in an investigative function, myself and the investigative wing actually firewalled ourselves off from participation so that there would be no conflict of interest. As you know, I regularly view body camera. And so do my investigators in working on cases. So I actually didn't see the audit report until the day it was released to the audit committee.
Okay,
Thank you.
Council President Johnson,
Mr. Chair, I kind of have a follow-up on Councilman Gordon's question.
please go ahead.
So I guess perhaps I haven't been following close enough, but why? What was the urgency of getting this report to us ahead of following the standard procedure for an audit? What drove the urgency?
Chairman Yang, Councilmember Johnson, as far as I know, it was the circumstances involved in the shooting in the 5th precinct that brought to great attention the non-usage of body cameras in that specific incident. We had generally been planning to do a readiness review with state statutes through our IT function, and OPCR was planning to later this year do some sort of evaluation around usage. And as we were discussing the events and potentially expanding our IT audit to cover some additional aspects that were prominent and important to the city, we established an aggressive timeline for ourselves because we felt like we had the resources and the time to do the assessment that we needed to do, especially with additional input from OPCR. And it was that approach combined with some potential policy changes that had occurred that made it seem worthwhile to get information and present it out to decision makers so that they could be informed as to what they were doing. And whatever the response is to the audit, our information is based on our observations, and a response wouldn't change our observations.
And Council President Johnson, I'd like to just add that I think, two of the drivers were just when the audit committee was going to meet next. So just their meeting time sometime in September. And I think the other thing, which would probably be kind of, let's say, on us, was the direction from this committee that, got worked out. And so, at that point, the expectation was that, they wanted and they said they could get it done in that timeline. And so I think that timeline was established by us as a committee, but also in consultation with audit. And, it was just kind of the timing of the meetings.
Mr. Chair, so I guess, it seems like one of the outcomes of that is that we have an audit that is not our typical standard process. I would hope that we have a product at the end of the back and forth that would mirror our standard process for looking at one of our departments and analyzing, whether they're doing their job correctly and following policy and all that sort of thing, and not be jumping ahead as to where the responsibility is, where the problems are, all that sort of thing, ahead of, again, our standard process. So I just feel like the volume publicly around this issue wasn't really very helpful in trying to take new technology and analyze it in the way that we would with any other investment. And I don't think that having I think it's a challenge when we have perhaps an incident that pushes something forward and then gives us an incomplete product. So I want us to be really careful about making sure that when we have a completed project here, it's a completed project just like any other department in the city would have, with input and recommendations then from the department that has to use the body cameras. And it sounds like we don't really have that yet.
Councilmember Palmisano.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to respond to some of the comments by my committee members. First, the idea that this state audit wasn't helpful. I think it was extremely helpful. First of all, we didn't need to actually do this audit for 2 years, and doing an audit early, and the reason it was on the 2017 audit committee's work plan was to make sure that we were going to be compliant with an audit from the state by state statute within 2 years. So this was an interim mark that had been on our agenda since the beginning of 2017 because we're making such a big investment in body cameras. I think that piece of this, the small part, that first chevron that's about Minnesota statutes that goes to the state, is complete. And it is, I think, a story that, as we talked about it more with both former police leadership and current police leadership, that it kind of shows that this is the beginning of a body camera program. The stuff that is about the Minnesota statute stuff is not bad. It's the sign of a beginning of a program. The rest of this, I think, is what Councilmember Yang and I are interested in doing and going forward, that this project is absolutely not complete, and it demands the attention. These findings demand the attention of our police department to look to how they will address them. And it is up to our police department to figure out how to address these findings, and we want to work with the police department to do better because we want to do this job right. So.
Councilmember Gordon.
I'm curious about how long you think it would take for us to complete the audit so it was brought up to our normal, typical standards.
Chairman Yang, Councilmember Gordon, I had one comment about completed audit, first of all, and that is even when our standard report with an initial response from the auditees included, that's not the end of the audit. The audit ends once those recommendations are implemented and we have verified that they're in place, and that can take a variety of time from a few weeks to sometimes years. As to how long it would take to provide a response, our standard process includes providing a report to the auditee and giving them approximately 2 weeks to provide a response to the initial findings and recommendations. And the initial response generally includes a statement of agreement with the findings, a separate statement of agreement with the recommendations, and any additional commentary that they wish to include. Generally, that includes some statements about we plan to take these kinds of steps. So I would expect on a typical audit, once we have a report in a completed state, it would take approximately 2 weeks for a respondent to provide us a complete report. in a particularly complex case, we have been flexible and provided more time to accommodate departments that need more time to figure out complex issues.
Councilmember?
Well, I'd like to move that we direct the police department and the civil rights department to work with the auditor's office to finish and complete that and complete their responses and return to the committee then. And I'm trying to look at the calendar for a good date, maybe in November, give however long it would take to come back to the committee so we can have a completed full report.
Councilmember Gordon, I'm going to ask you to look at the motion before you by Councilmember Palmisano and myself with regard to that. It's probably a little bit more general than what you'd expect from what you just made in terms of a motion. It's a short one, actually. And I think that that gives a bit more time than, what was presented to us. And I think it allows us to have, in that time period from between now and I think it's February of 2018. I mean, it gives us, enough time to, get a completed audit that you're talking about in terms of having the police department have a response. So if you can take a look at that, and if you...
I did look at it and read it,
Okay.
and the missing piece here is that actually to complete the audit so that our report feels as full and complete and up to the standard of all the other reports. And I'm concerned that it isn't, and so this will be a report. It'll go to the state. Now, apparently, it's already been approved and sent on, so I'm not sure what to do about that. But it seems like we could take your motion and say it's almost what I'm saying, but really what I want to say is actually work together so we can complete the full audit report and then get a completed version back to us
Okay.
at some date. So
Why don't you just add that to this?
I'll work
motion
on it
here.
while you guys.
Okay, why don't you do that? And
take-
Councilmember Palmisano, why don't you try to answer some of those questions? I mean, especially related to the part about filing with the state. What gets to go to the state? What is missing here? Because it seems like we're talking past each other here.
Right. So I guess first let's take on the piece about the Minnesota statutes and the state law. Mr. Vasiliev, can you help this committee understand exactly and only what gets submitted to the state in this audit? Because it is a very small portion of this report.
Chairman Yang, Councilmember Palmisano, I'm testing my memory here, but if I remember the state statute, it requires a summary of the results of the audit to be provided, and the audit component that is required by the state is compliance with the audit statutes. So that would be the statement of, we reviewed compliance with these elements of the state statute, these were compliant, these were non-compliant, and we would likely include specifically which elements were non-compliant. But I believe a full report that states how exactly things were non-compliant is not part of what is required by the statute, but I am not a lawyer, so I defer to somebody else.
So if just to summarize, a lot of the things that are required by state statute are more technical in nature, Councilmember Gordon. They're not all of the different elements of this body camera study. I think that if I hear my colleague, I think that if I understand your concerns specifically, it would be about actually getting the findings, the response back from the police department, and sooner rather than later on the findings from the audit, right? So what you are looking for is the police department's opportunity to respond. And some of this has been a change in leadership over during these last 4 weeks of the audit, to where, communication was taking place with some former police leadership, and now it needs to be taking place with new police leadership. But to give new police leadership an opportunity to address each and every one of these findings is something that you would like sooner than later. Is that my understanding?
Mr. Chair, yes, I would. So the idea maybe is that we could get back to our committee even by the end of November. So I think November 29th would be a committee date. A completed version of the audit that would have the response from the police department And I think one of the ideas about getting it back earlier, especially before budget approval, might, because there might be some kind of considerations or something we'd want to know about. I'm not sure, but that might be one of the police response might say, oh, we could do better with this or with that if we had some funding. But I'm also fine with other outstanding issues. The rest of the motion here talks about not a report back till the end of February 2018. We could keep working on it that long too, but
So the intent of this motion was actually to report back on progress made on findings. So when I hear, Councilmember Gordon, when I hear your concern, I appreciate it, and I think that we should have the police response to findings back. The audit is done. It's been accepted by the committee, approved by the council. The audit is complete, but the police department's response to all the findings in this audit is what is, I think, necessary, and you appreciate is necessary to move forward.
so we'd have to move to reconsider as a council to actually have the audit report amended? Or could we approve a revised audit report later?
I don't know what the value is in doing that. I'm looking at my colleague who's also part of audit committee over
Well, just
here.
so when we have the document and we pull it off the shelf, it looks like the other audits and we have the response in it. That's all. I guess.
Councilmember Gordon, I mean, my sense of it, and I will ask the city attorney to help us out on this, but my sense of it is that, if we want to revise this, if, let's say at the end of the day, police get a response and they give a response to this, we can move a revised version at some later date, and that would be fine.
That's mine.
Thank you.
That's my question.
Okay, so, I mean, if we can do that, let me just say, Councilmember Palmisano, go ahead.
With all due respect, Chair Yang, I just want to point out that, as Mr. Vasiliev points out, that the role of audit on findings is to help departments continue to work on findings. So I'm not interested in going and revising every single audit, every audit committee meeting with the new responses and the updated progress on audits, but rather, as Mr. Vasiliev said, this audit is complete. These observations don't change, but certainly we should, and more specifically from this committee, from public safety, track and work with our police department on some of these significant audit findings that came out of this audit, and we should continue to work on that, I believe, through this committee of council, because our audit committee directs our internal auditor, not the police department.
Councilmember Gordon?
I can appreciate that. I still would somehow like to get the police responses formally entered into the record somehow within a reasonable amount of time. So we don't necessarily have to call it with a revised version of the audit report, but I am interested in getting them sooner than February 2018.
Sure.
Okay, but I think with regards to this, I mean, this is kind of the farthest date. I mean, it can come back sooner.
I don't mean to speak out of turn, but
No,
could
Councilmember Palmisano.
an option here that includes Councilmember Gordon's concerns be to receive the police department's response to audit findings here when at the November 29th Public Safety Committee meeting, or if that isn't soon enough, the one prior to it. It almost seems like it's maybe better as its own separate motion that adds receiving the police department's opportunity to respond to the findings at a future meeting of public safety.
Yeah, that makes sense. Maybe it should be a separate motion, or it could be part of the longer motion, which does mention the 29th date on there.
Are you comfortable with the 29th?
Yes.
Okay. I think we should do that.
Okay, well, so let's figure this out. Councilmember Palmisano, can you make that first motion of that Schwartz piece, and then we'll get on to the next one. And after we take care of all the audit stuff, we will go into the meat of the audit so that the assistant chief can answer some questions.
Mm-hmm. So first, although procedurally this is last, this motion before you, the one that's 3 lines plus a tiny bit long, is that the chair and I would like to move that the police department work with the auditor's office to address outstanding issues that have been raised by previous audits of the body-worn camera program, and to ask that the police department and the auditor's office report back on this progress by the end of February of next year. This would be about progress made on the program, so there is time involved then for like testing that these are working and that this approach is is actually going to solve the problems that were identified. So I will move that.
Any discussion on that?
So I guess I'll withdraw my previous motion that I think might have been properly before us.
Okay. My apologies, Councilmember Gordon.
Carefully ignored. Okay.
All right. Seeing that there is no discussion, all those in approval, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. All right. Councilmember Palmisano, why don't you go on with the second motion?
So then, Mr. Chair, if I may, and in working with Councilmember Gordon, I'd like to put the second motion before you from Chair Yang and myself. The first part of this motion is to have quarterly reports to Public Safety Committee regarding the operation of body-worn cameras. The reports from the police department on a quarterly basis will include how often, both total number and percentage, are body cameras not being turned on when dispatch data indicates that they should. It's about considering and talking about any changes made to body camera policy during that time and seeing if there are changes being considered. Also, making sure we have somebody in charge of the ongoing effectiveness of the body camera program and discussing the emerging themes of reviewed data. So what issues are being identified and how are training and discipline being handled. That would be on a quarterly basis. And that would start the first quarter of 2018. The second staff direction here, and this is the one that I think we want to amend based on Councilmember Gordon's input, is for the November 29th public safety meeting, we ask that the police department report on supervisor reviews of officers' body camera worn footage. One of the things that came out of this report was that supervisors were just then being trained on doing reviews of the body worn cameras. And so this speaks to aspects of that, just making sure that they are following through and that that's going smoothly. I think then I'd like to add to that Councilmember Gordon's request, which would be a detailed report, if that's what you want it to be, of a response of all 20 of those findings that were in the audit itself to council then at the November 29th Public Safety Committee meeting.
Councilmember Gordon?
I think that sounds close enough. I don't know how many adjectives we have to have about their response, but yeah, it should be a response to the findings of the audit report. I guess what I'm looking for is a revised and complete audit report. I don't think we can necessarily tell the auditor and the audit committee what to do either from our position, but I consider the report, this is me editorializing, but I'll go along with that motion and probably support it, but I consider the report incomplete the way it is now.
Okay, so we have a motion before us. Any discussion? Council President Johnson?
I have a question, Mr. Chair. On item 4 here, how is training and discipline handled as new issues emerge? I think that is, one of the sort of deep dive questions is how will we develop policy as far as what is discipline for officers that don't use a body camera or don't do it following the policy. But I mean, I don't think we have the answer to that yet. I guess and I would wonder, and maybe this is a question for when the police get up here, just to ask how will a discipline matrix be developed around non-use or incomplete use or whatever. So I think we might be stepping a little ahead of ourselves on this.
Okay. if you're okay with it, if we can hold off on that question until
Okay.
I guess we handle
Great.
this, and unless you want this question handled right now.
Let's see. I just would ask maybe then how is training and discipline handled as new issues emerge might come out of the motion there. So we're asking for information. What are the emerging themes? What issues are being identified by supervisors? And if we're getting a quarterly report, maybe we can then ask for, after our first quarterly report, what is the status of policies being proposed and implemented around non-use or misuse of the body cameras. I just think we're stepping ahead of ourselves by saying that. So
Okay. Good, sir.
Chairman Yang, Council President Johnson, I do believe there is a discipline matrix that I saw for body camera usage. I think there were 4 categories, and I know one of them was if you destroy a body camera, that's definitely a specific element. I don't know that there's a tie-in with any kind of supervisory reviews that may or may not be ongoing, and that's probably the important piece, but we're not going to tell the police department what to do. We're reporting on what's going on, and it's definitely up to them to decide how best to implement this, so long as it addresses the findings. I think that's our goal.
Councilmember Palmisano.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think the Council President brings up a good point, and I would be happy to retract with your agreement this second question in item number 4 up top, which would be, in discussion of emerging themes of reviewed data and what issues are being identified, discipline might become an issue, but we don't know that for sure at this point. So I'd be happy to remove that. And then just to be clear, because you're right, I did use a lot of adjectives there, Councilmember Gordon. I think the additional language at the bottom for the November 29th meeting would simply say, and a response to the findings of the audit.
All right. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in approval, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, the motion carries. All right, so I think we've talked about a lot of technical stuff. Anybody want to delve into this report, or I'll go ahead, Councilmember Palmisano.
I have a lot of questions for this report.
Okay.
Are we at that point?
We are at that point.
Great. I think my questions are more appropriately addressed to the police. Mr. Vasiliev, thank you for your help in conducting this audit. Last week in audit committee, there were some questions from audit committee members that I just didn't feel it was, appropriate to lop right on to you at the time, but I did say we'd be asking them later, and we'd be asking them at the Public Safety Committee meeting. So if I may, Assistant Chief Jose, here are, they're on a sheet of paper here. Here are a couple of them. One was, could you just briefly remind us, because it's been a while, about how the implementation of body cameras worked from a training perspective? That was something that was asked, and just briefly,
Yes.
We'd like to understand that. Yeah.
Yes, again, I'm Assistant Chief Mike Jose. Happy to be here. I'd like to thank the auditor, the internal audit group, for doing this. I know it was a difficult process to go through, and the police department, we are happy to be involved at this point and be able to give some input into the findings and maybe clarify some of the questions that come out of the observations that they've noted. So implementation training was done by precinct, so one precinct at a time. First, it required a significant installation process of hardware to be able to download the programs and to store them and charge and so that there was a fairly lengthy installation process that took place over many months in each precinct. And then once a precinct became ready to be fully operational, then one precinct at a time was identified for a several-day instruction and then hands-on use. And then Lieutenant Reinhardt from our business technology unit and a couple of his officers that he works with, a sergeant and officer, would go to that precinct and schedule each officer, sergeant, lieutenant that would be receiving a body camera to come in and sit in a classroom setting and be issued the equipment. The policy was gone over through PowerPoint and verbal instruction, quite Q&A opportunity with the officers, and then they would be taught how to handle the equipment, including how to sync your phone to the device, how to label videos and that sort of thing, and then shown how to upload it. Not only how to use the individual camera, but also how to use the phone to take pictures and be able to upload them as well to the same system, so that we're actually getting more than just a video, but also an evidence gathering tool with a high definition camera on the phone as well.
Assistant Chief Joseph, it was also, you did involve the opt-in people from the pilot program, right, to help with the training, is my understanding, that they could give their own rendition of how the body cameras helped them in their day-to-day work.
Yes, most of the pilot program people, so we had done a pilot the year before, were very helpful to us, not just with new officers coming in, but also kind of assisting with media to demonstrate how the equipment worked in a real-time basis. And those officers that did the pilot were more than happy to come and express how they used the equipment and the value they saw in it.
I just want to point out, Mr. Chair, that the training of officers in the use of the body-worn cameras seemed to go well in the audit. There didn't seem to be a lot of holes or gaps in there. Assistant Chief, another question that was asked was about off-duty work and the body-worn camera policy. Can you explain to us a little bit about how this works? Because I think that we found gaps in that.
Yes. Well, currently our policy is that if you're issued a body camera, you have to follow the same policy rules, whether you're working your regular job or you're working a part-time job, same rules. And the issue with that is that not all our officers have body cameras. So when officers are working part-time jobs, it can be very confusing to whether a supervisor gets involved or a citizen's involved, that one officer may have a body camera and one may not. And so that is a very complex area for us. And that is one of the reasons the chief has asked for additional funding, is to try to get all of our officers issued a body camera so that you can have a blanket policy that kind of crosses all realms. It is a very complex issue. The whole, part-time is one aspect, but there's also a lot of different types of work that take place within the police department. And the body camera issue or policy was really written for a uniform officer responding as a 911 responder to calls. And, the more that we dig into this policy, the more we're finding flaws in if you're a uniform officer part of the time, but you're maybe a plainclothes officer or an undercover officer, we do not have anything built into this policy that dictates how an undercover officer would be exempt from having a body camera on. It's kind of hard to do undercover work with a body camera sitting on you. So that those types of issues are coming to light the more that we dig into this, that it's a very complex issue. I think our policy is somewhere close to 11 pages deep already, and we haven't even touched on some of the audit issues that we were self-imposing leading up to this, teaching sergeants how to do audits, but we don't have it built into the policy so that they know what the process is. So one of the good things about this whole process that's taking place right now is it's allowing us to see spots that were missed or just not thought of moving forward. And so we really need to look at the total package. And it is good for us to, at least at this point, to be brought into this process so that I know that during the last committee hearing, there were several questions that the answer was, well, that answer would be better answered by the police department. And which we feel we would offer some value into some of the audit findings if we could, give some experience into situations as to why maybe there wasn't a body camera turned on here, or why it was turned off, or what would be a reason for turning it on or turning it off, and carry over from one call to another call. The job of being a police officer is a very fluid role, that you roll from one incident to another and back and forth very fluidly. And currently within this audit process, if I had my body camera on and I went from one call to the next call and I didn't deactivate it and then restart it for the next one, there would be no body camera assigned to the next call. So I was monitoring some calls this morning, and I was listening to officers when everybody was tied up, and the dispatcher aired a couple of calls. I hope that you're okay with me expounding a little. Dispatch said, I need 2 squads to clear and take these 2 priority calls. And an officer cleared over the air. I'll clear, put my report call in pending, and I'll go take that call. And then another squad cleared and said, no, that's my call. That's my area. I'll clear, put my call in pending. I'll take that call. And then the dispatcher sent the officer on the other call. And so right now at this point, you got 2 squads. If there's 2 cops in those squads, which is our standard, that's 4 calls being dealt with. And if they had their body camera on from the first call, there wouldn't be a body camera recorded for the second call unless they shut it off. And right about that time, the dispatcher said, well, now transit needs a squad to back them up. So one of those squads then said, well, put those 2 calls in pending and I'll take the third call. And I'm sitting here going, if they had the body cameras on the first call and didn't turn it off to start it again for the next call and the subsequent call, so that there'd be an individual body camera recording for each call, at this point, we'd be up to, there were 4 recordings, but audit would say there should have been 10. And so, it's a complex issue when you start looking at every single call and how they roll into each other. And we really don't want our officers turning their body camera off just so they can turn it on to say that I'm off of this call, I'm on this call, because that just adds more downtime later to have to go back and label. And but those are things we have to work out. We have to figure out how to get to that point that we can roll from one to the next, and because any downtime reduces our ability to provide service. And ultimately our job is to be out there providing service to the public. And we don't want this to actually cause some sort of delay in service to the public.
Thank you for that explanation, Assistant Chief Jost. I'm curious. It would seem like in what you just described that then there would be a lot more than 1 minute of body camera footage per hour of time worked in that specific time frame. I'm curious if I could ask Mr. Vasiliev as a follow-up question, how would something like that work, that an officer would go to multiple calls? Because I understand that this was it was metadata. I understand the process as to how we knew if body camera was on at a call, that the later report showed that it should have been on. So could you speak to what Assistant Chief just mentioned in terms of would those 3 consecutive calls really be flagged as just one video that would exist? It would certainly increase the time that the body cameras were on, but Mr. Vasiliev, in the sampling that you did, just from an ongoing perspective and how we continue to monitor this program.
Chairman Yang, Councilmember Palmisano, the way we looked at our data, and I think sitting down and going through some of the details for working on implementation would really help clear that out. When reviewing dispatch data, we eliminated all officers that don't have an arrival time at the scene. So we tried to eliminate those individuals that got dispatched to 3 things at the same time and only went to 1. And I believe every time we looked for a video, we looked by the entered case ID. If the case ID was not entered or there wasn't a match, we looked by officer name, time of the dispatch to line up with arrival time to hopefully flag a video that might cover 2 back-to-back cases. We tried to accommodate for differences in data as we were doing our assessments. And I think there's definitely opportunities for, on a more targeted level by supervisor review, to be able to see and know much more about each individual call as folks are responding to them and have a more precise metric than what we tried to do, which was try to look at all the data without really targeting any one officer.
So I appreciate that. I think that's kind of a difference of the way that maybe like last week the police department looked at data and just saw the great number of additional videos, right, that what you just mentioned wouldn't have captured, versus like a more detailed look and how do we set that up to be monitored over time. And I think that's something that our audit team can help work with Commander Granger to really help set up. Another question I had was about coding. Assistant Chief Jose, I've heard lots of things from the community about why footage would be coded as training so much, but one of the questions was, well, is that just the default? And actually, I don't think it is. I think that uncategorized is the default, in which case this footage gets kept forever. But can you comment on what do you think could be done to get officers to code their recordings correctly, and how important is that?
Yes, and this brings up a whole deeper discussion about what's the data behind the audit findings, because it would be very helpful to us be able, in any area, including the training, closure, or coding, to have the data that manifested that finding, that so that we could look at, is there a pattern? Is it actually people that are doing training? Is it somebody that's recruits? Like we train our recruits on the same equipment. Are they in training? So I really don't have a good answer as to why anything would be tagged as training unless it's actually from training. But we would want to just take the data and glance at it, or examine it and say, are these people in training? It's before I can answer that, I'd have to look at who are the personnel, and is there a pattern that we can examine? Is it the same people? Is it maybe one group that was trained a certain way and the instructor gave them made some sort of comment that suggested marking things training? But I really don't know why there would be a bunch of training videos out there short of actually conducting training. And we do a lot of live training with our recruits and our new officers where we're teaching them how to use equipment, so they're actually marking it, in a way that it's all going into the same system. But I would really need to look at more data, and it will be good for us to sit down and actually look at some data, about this whole audit. One example being, audit findings that we're not in compliance with a state statute or something like that. It would be really nice for us if we could get the list of what statutes that we're not in compliance with. And I was asking, and I really appreciate Deputy Chief Halverson that he's spent hours and hours looking at this audit now and trying to, but I asked him today, he's having to read statutes and dig through statutes and read policy. And if they just tell us what ones we're not in compliance with, it would actually speed up the process so that we could, maybe come with some answers quicker. And actually, we want to make fixes as soon as possible. We don't want to wait for, some date in November to come back and implement changes. We want to do them on the fly, but without too many total changes of the policy. We can implement changes in process as we go forward, even before a new policy has to be written, and get ourselves headed in the right direction.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate that. I also think that is a value of this audit, is there are recommendations on how to make quick action on some of those things, and perhaps some of the ones that are deemed most critical versus ones that are maybe technical in nature but but less important. Mr. Chair, I don't mean to take everybody's time, but my last two questions, one is about discipline and the other is about the budget. Is there still time for that?
Yes, absolutely. Let's go ahead. Sir, we have a meeting here. This is not a public hearing, so we will continue. Councilmember Palmisano. Sir. Sir. Yep. Go ahead, Councilmember Palmisano. Go ahead, Councilmember Palmisano.
Thank you. Assistant Chief Jose, just to be a little bit more clear about the supervisory role and discipline, because that was talked a lot about last week, is not following this policy considered like insubordination? I don't think so, and I'm just unclear as to where the supervisory role of having your body camera on sits in our. It's not really in our policy. It's not. Can you comment on that?
Yes, we're still in the early stages of what the actual supervisor audit process is. We did some training so that they were fully aware of how to do it, and to at least give them the tools so they would know how to look at their employees and see if they're following policy, and then to give them coaching and instruction and mentorship to get them up and running. But the actual policy itself does not have governance in there as to what that supervisor is required to do, even though it was given to them in class and instruction. And that is something the union has brought to us as well, that they would like to see specific direction to those supervisors. We do have levels of discipline built into the policy for violations. It's a matrix system, and Chief Arredondo is looking at that now at this point, and to really make sure that there's full clear policy from beginning to end as to what is a violation, what is the discipline that would come with a violation, and then also repeated violations and escalating discipline to meet whatever the situation is.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I also know that the police is in process of doing some things to automatically turn these cameras on and off, so that could remove some of the human factor errors and just going about day-to-day work. I guess I'm more concerned with routine disuse of a body camera and how we can improve that figure. Something that was mentioned last week by the police union chief was about a concern about battery life, and something that I thought was really important that came out of the audit that wasn't one of the specifics we spoke about today, but I do want to mention that all of the footage that was sampled shows exactly how much battery life is left, and that was never a problem through the audit, that the body cameras that were carefully chosen by the police department do not have a battery life difficulty. It might impact then that upload again, and especially when cameras are used or not off-duty work, that would come into play. I understand that the technology unit issued chargers to all officers so that they could actually continue to charge even in a vehicle or at home to recharge a body-worn camera, but that is another concern that I just wanted to outline. The question about the budget really came to light last week when it was understood that SWAT team officers didn't currently have body cameras and weren't issued body cameras within our program. We're going through our budget process right now as a city. I'm curious, and I think maybe this is a question more for later when you come back with findings, but is there anything we need to fund in order to make this program work better? I mean, I really have to say, over the last 2 years, I've tried to take opportunities where I saw them to be fit in the records information unit and in other places, and it was not seen by the police department to be something that they wanted to fund. And so now that we're going through this budget process, and especially I know the budget was delayed in part due to some changes in public safety Like, I'm curious, and what I think every committee member up here is curious about is there anything we need to fund in order to make this program work better? You know, is this a resource issue that we try to expand the number of cameras on officers without necessarily all the infrastructure there to really make it successful? So as we go about that finding, we are curious, and part of, I think, the advantage of this coming back yet this year, thanks to Councilmember Gordon, is to make sure that we can assess that. And I think we are very committed. We are almost $8 million into this program in terms of the city having allocated that over the first 5 years of this program. And if there is something that is going to help us make this successful or not, we always said, and I remember back in February saying that in order to build the goals of this program into of transparency and accountability into a body camera program in the state of Minnesota based on state law, that it would be a labor-intensive process. It wouldn't be a simple change. It would be a labor-intensive process. And I'm just really curious what kinds of changes will come from the police to help us make this successful. I know we want it to make this better, and we want to work well with you. So I don't know if you have any thoughts right now as to what you need from that, or if you want to just reserve that for later.
That's a long question. I appreciate it, Councilmember Palmisano. Well, obviously, the equipment, there are some equipment expenses just to get everybody issued a body camera. And that, you know, and I don't have the figure in front of me, but there's a fair amount of expense to that. But really, an expense that would help us greatly is personnel. And I'm talking not officers, but the chief and I have had great discussion about having a couple of civilians assigned specifically to do internal audit within our organization of the body cameras. That would be a newly created position that's a full-time spot. And leading up to this, Commander Granger had implemented a process of having shift supervisors do auditing for the and we can call it auditing, but reviewal of the, and, you know, from our perspective, we would like to have shift supervisors out supervising their people on the street and not sitting at a computer, you know, clicking through audit reports and video to see if, you know, everything was done. I come from the technology background. I ran our so I can look at reports and things and pick out little things that mean something to me because I know that there's a piece of data missing or the data just doesn't look right, which always irritates our computer people that I can do that. But but most of our officers are not that computer savvy, and neither of our supervisors. So we want to come up with a process that we do daily auditing of video with some civilian staff that can assist supervisors with, here's some issues you need to address with these particular people, and take action immediately and be proactive about catching mistakes or problems or just errors, whatever it is, whether it's labeling or activation and deactivation times, so that we're in front of it. We don't want to wait for it to become a discipline issue. We want to be in front of it so that we're in compliance. And we also need to make sure our policy makes sense. You know, the current policy has an awful lot of recording time of just downtime. It's driving time. And it seems that isn't really what is the value of this product. Isn't two officers sitting in a traffic jam waiting to get to a call. And I had one officer just this week tell me about 2 calls back to back, and they recorded 86 minutes of downtime in the car and 1 minute of interaction at a call where the car was GOA or whatever it was. And it was I don't think that was the spirit of putting body cameras in place, was just to record 2 officers sitting in a squad car talking to each other stuck in traffic. And so that's something where we're going to have to come up with a policy that makes more sense to actually get the value out on the scenes and not just travel time. And there's lots of ways to do that. You mentioned the automated system in the car. The one we're implementing right now is simply if you turn on your lights, it turns on your body camera. That's one reason. I mean, what percentage of our calls do you actually have your lights on if it's report calls and things like that? So that's only a tiny piece of capturing the total package. But really so expense-wise is we need to add a couple of civilian staffers that are computer savvy that can do these audits and can get that information out so that we can now take action. And if it means discipline, you go down that road. But most of the time, when people are given direction immediately following an incident or situation or within days of some recording, they'll alter their behavior just from, taking some corrective action close to when it occurred. So that would be one area that what we plan to do in the interim till we can get those job positions created is to redirect a current employee from a current position that we know that the individual is somewhat tech savvy, and we can say, okay, you know how to do this type of work. We need you to switch over from policy writing or whatever it is and have you do this. And so we're starting to have that discussion now about which is the right employee to do that without added expense. But at some point, we need to add some full-time personnel for that purpose.
Thank you. Those are my questions.
Council members, any other questions or comments? All right, seeing none, I'm just going to close it out by not asking that many questions. But Inspector Joseph, if you can step up. I know you saw all this motion practice about, just the audit issues related to that, MPD not getting a response or not getting a chance to respond and all that stuff. We talked about all these different things. But, at the end of the day, though, I do want to say, this audit that we have right now, I think it's a valuable tool. I think that it's rich in information in terms of the findings, in terms of the holes that we have, in our body cam program, the holes that we have, in MPD with regards to the body-worn cameras and the mobile cameras as well. And I think that it's really important that MPD takes this seriously. And I really appreciate your approach, which is an approach of not being defensive, but more so just embracing that we have this audit and that we're going to fix every single issue that we may have. Because I think a lot of these numbers that we look at, we should be really perfect. We shouldn't be having holes here and there. Councilmember Palmisano had mentioned a bit about SWAT not having body cams, and that wasn't my understanding when we rolled it out, that SWAT officers did have cameras. The issue was then who was going to turn it on at the scene of an incident, instead of just SWAT officers not turning any on and not having them. Those things kind of confuse me, and I think if it confuses folks who are on the council, I think it's going to confuse the public as well. And I think people have these expectations that our body cam program is solid, that the whole thing works out well. And I think having this audit, at the end of the day, I just want to say, we're all a team. The problem that we will have is not that this audit came out and it's public. The problem we will have is that if we don't fix the problems, that will be our problem in the public. And I think that this is a prime opportunity for us to look at all these problems and fix these problems so that the public doesn't see us not doing anything, basically. Because, you look at the summary of just the whole report, non-compliance with the state laws. Well, we kind of have to fix that. That's critical. And, I think, this process of, MPD giving a response to the audit, we will get that done, I'm hopeful. But not only that, non-compliance with our own body cam policy. We need to get into compliance. That's on us, as a city, but also as MPD. The third thing is, we have some issues related to training that we need to fix. And, I think, one of the biggest problems that I saw in this was just understanding who's in charge. Is it the assistant chief? Is it the deputy chief? Who is it? Is it Lieutenant Reinhardt? Who is it? And, I think, in terms of that, we need to figure out, okay, so is it public safety, this committee that is overseeing some of these things, or is it the mayor's office? We got to figure that out, and we got to figure that out quick, because it's not acceptable that, we have this great toy, $8 million toy that's out there, and but we don't know who's in charge. And so I think we need to figure those things out. And those are kind of critical to how this program is successful. And I think at the end of the day, I mean, I really appreciate your approach to this. And I hope, it's the approach of the police department that we got to fix everything. So this thing is as perfect as possible. I understand there are humans, involved. And so it's not going to be completely perfect, but to be as perfect as possible so that, the public can have faith in this process. The public can trust that this process or this program is working. Because, all I see when I see these problems are millions of dollars of liabilities that we may get sued, on some case in which we didn't follow policies and those sorts of things. And that's, as a council member, that's my biggest fear. And so, I thank you for being here. Hopefully, it wasn't a bad process in the sense that, MPD hasn't had a chance to respond. I think the process continuing until we get a final report is that MPD is going to get a chance to respond to this audit. And hopefully, it's not a defensive response, but more so just a response of, we're going to fix all these things and make it work. And so, I'm closing with that. I don't know if any other council members have anything to add, but thank you so much for being here. Thank you to the internal audit department for being here. Thank you to everybody here. And with no further business before this committee, I will adjourn this meeting. Wait. Let me take that back. I need to make a motion for us to receive and file this report. So I will make that motion. Any discussion? All right, seeing none, all those in approval, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Thank you. And with no further business before this committee, I will adjourn this meeting. Thank you so much.